All right, Criminal Week 3. Topics today. We're going to continue common law offenses. The issue of common law offenses, looking at the Jobinall case, the United Nurses of Alberta. We're going to continue with vagueness, overbreadth, and certainty, looking at the Haywood case and the Canadian Foundation for Children, Youth and Law case. And we're going to move on to the construction and interpretation of the criminal code, looking at R versus Paré, or the Queen versus Paré, and the limits of criminal law, looking at the definite part debate. So common law offenses continued. In the Jobinall case, it was a bar fight that led to a street fight where one person was killed. And the issues here is, if there is consent, is it assault? And can you consent away your Section 7 charter rights? And this led to a great debate between Gaultier and Sapinka. So according to Gaultier, consent is a defense in the code, but according to the common law, that vitiates consent or weakens the consent between adults in a fist fight or a brawl, provided that there is no clear language in the code that contradicts the common law, which some would argue there is. So, according to the common law, consent to fight in private or public is not a defense to a charge of assault if actual bodily harm is intended or caused. So what Jobinall is saying is that, despite the fact that assault in the criminal law says without consent, the common law says that consent is required. And so, or the common law says that consent is a defense. And Jobinall is saying that it is a defense unless bodily harm is intended or caused. So the criminal code regarding assault is sort of, I guess, read down by the common law unless bodily harm is intended or caused. Now what Sapinka is saying is that that's absurd. It says without consent in the statute. That language is clear, so you have to injure someone without their consent. That language is clear. And if that's not part of it, if someone has given you consent, well, then you haven't committed the actus reus. So what he's saying is that Gaultier has created a new offense where the actus reus is assault between consenting fighters. And the mens rea is desire to inflict bodily harm. And this is counter to the criminal code. It says consent is a fundamental element of many criminal offenses, including assault, and the statutory provision creating the offense of assault explicitly provides the element of consent. Now, the issue, that's an interesting debate regarding the creation of common law offenses. So Sapinka is saying you can't just create another common law offense. This case was decided on the fact, however, that the person who died went unconscious and the other person hit them, which means they didn't have consent anyway. So the big issue is common law versus statute law. The courts cannot create criminal offenses, and that's exactly what Sapinka was alleging Gaultier was doing by interpreting statute. Gaultier says he's not guilty because the common law says so. Sapinka says he's guilty, well, despite the fact that he punched him while he was unconscious. And the statute says that assault is without consent. The purpose of the law is not to outlaw consensual fighting. So the purpose of the assault law is not to outlaw consensual fighting. And regardless, Jobinall struck the victim after he went unconscious. So common law versus the code. The code is the law, but there are ambiguities which need to be interpreted. So we use the common law default principles which have emerged out of common law for centuries. So it's an iterative process, a back and forth process. Some people say the common law principles are more important, and other people say that the reading of the legislature is more important. So there's kind of a back and forth there and a debate over which is more important. We turn to the United Nurses of Alberta, and the issue here is contempt of court isn't in the code, and so it's unconstitutional to charge them with it. All the offenses must be certain, you need fair notice. And what was decided here is that it is a common law offense, even though I thought common law offenses were abolished. And it's expressly preserved in Section 9 of the Criminal Code, which I don't have that in front of me. So they were nonetheless found in contempt of court, which muddies the issue even further. So we move on to vagueness in the Criminal Code. There must be no crime punished except in accordance with fixed and predetermined laws. So under Section 7 of the Charter is a principle of fundamental justice that the laws may not be too vague. And this is founded on the principle of fair notice to citizens and the limitation of enforcement discretion. So fair notice to citizens means that that the citizens are deemed to know the laws, and in order to do that, they need to be in the criminal code, and they need to be clear and not vague, because ignorance of the law is no defense. So having the criminal code, having the legs, the laws not vague, is considered fair notice to citizens. Vagueness is also an issue with discretion. So when the power to decide between conviction and acquittal becomes fused with the power to prosecute, then the law is unconstitutionally vague. So if everyone that's being charged with that law is being convicted of that law, then it's too vague. It's the meaning isn't precise enough. It also means that the cops or the police can pick up anyone who fits under, anyone doing anything that fits under that law, which is probably going to be far too many people if the law is vague. So maybe many more actions fit under that law than were intended. So this puts too much discretion in the hands of law enforcement officials, where it should be the fact that they know exactly when someone is breaking this law or that law. It's worth noting that most challenges under Section 7 of the Charter on the basis of vagueness have failed, except Haywood. We'll get to that. Overbreadth. So the law is vague when it's not clearly defined. It's overbroad when it's clearly defined, but the provisions are too sweeping. So the question must be asked, are the means necessary to achieve the state objective? So and they need to be the least intrusive means. So if you want to catch people who are guilty of domestic violence, you can't make a law that says anyone that's charged or anyone found yelling is, can be taken in for questioning. That's far too overbroad. Okay, we look at Haywood. Is this too overbroad, or is this overbroad? So it says that no loitering in or near a school ground, playground, public park, bathing area for persons with past sexual violence convictions, and the majority here focused on the individual rights of the people who have been charged with sexual convictions. And it says that it's overbroad in the geographical scope, so you can't go anywhere, any public parks or beaches, no matter how remote or devoid of children. It's overly broad in the temporal aspect, in the sense that it is for life and there's no process of review. It's overly broad in the number of persons it encompasses, so everyone with a sexual conviction. And the accused isn't given notice that the prohibitions are put in place. Also, there's a new section 161 of the Criminal Code that was acted shortly after the decision of the British Columbia Court of Appeal. So this section of this part of the Criminal Code was enacted shortly after Haywood's decision was case was decided by the British Columbia Court of Appeal. And there's clearly defined geographical limits. It's limited to where children can reasonably be expected to be, provides a system of review for the accused, and they need to be notified of the provisions. So there's obviously less intrusive means for achieving the state objective. So we look at the charter. The overbroadness could possibly be justified in a section 1 of the charter, so as a reasonable breach of charter rights, but it violates section 7. And section 7 can usually only be justified in times of war or national emergencies. So section 7 is the right to, I forget what it is, fundamental justice, and anyway. And the dissent doesn't think it violates section 7. So Gontier is concerned about the public interest. He doesn't think they need to be notified. They're deemed to know the law. A lifetime prohibition isn't objectionable. It does not violate the presumption of innocence. If they break a law, they will be presumed innocence, and the punishment is not grossly proportionate when you consider the public interest. So the key to Heywood here is that breathe new life into the void for doctrine of, or the doctrine of void for vagueness. And it also contradicts the Canada versus Pharmaceutical Society, and in that case they decided that matters of overbreadth only dealt with section 1. So laws that may breach charter rights that are still laws need to be justified under section 1. This law was, there were no breaches of the charter assumed, so it was not justified under section 1. And so, despite the fact that no one challenged the fact that this law was breaching charter rights, it could still be challenged as overbroad. So it didn't need to become a law because of section 1, which would, say that it is possibly, it's definitely breaching on some charter rights. It was, a fairly standard law, but could still be challenged as being overbroad. So, we turn to the Canadian Foundation for Children, Youth and the Law, and we continue talking about vagueness. I guess the last one was overbreadth. Here we have vagueness. So section 43 of the Criminal Code, authorizing the use of force by way of correction towards a pupil or child if the force does not exceed what is reasonable under the circumstances. And here we have some vague terms. So what is correction? What is reasonable under the circumstances? And the majority decided it would be unconstitutionally vague. So this is the test for unconstitutionally vague. If it does not provide an adequate basis for legal debate and analysis. So looking forward in the future, is this law going to provide the precision that we need in order to have, good legal debate around it? And it has to sufficiently delineate the areas of risks. So there needs to be some certainty around when you're approaching the risk zone of being charged with a criminal act. And it's vague if it's not intelligible, if you can't understand it. So the question is, does the wording of the statute provide sufficient precision to delineate the zone of risk and to avoid undesirable discretionary law enforcement? So does it provide fair notice, and will it eliminate discretion, or I guess unwarranted discretion with the police? So the majority decided that, according to the common law, there are restrictions on this statute, though they admit that they are inconsistently applied. So the restrictions are, and these are meant to limit the vagueness of correction and reasonable, so that they're intelligible, they delineate the area of risk, and they can provide some kind of context for legal debate. So a parent must be a person standing in place of a parent who has assumed all the obligations of parenthood. The force must not result in harm or the prospect of bodily harm. The punishment of children under 2 years is considered harmful. Corporal punishment using objects or blows to the head are considered harmful. Corporal punishment by teachers is not acceptable, though this law will protect them in reasonable corrective force to restrain or move a child. The force must be corrective. The force cannot be degrading or inhuman. It cannot be used against teenagers. And it should not relate to the gravity of the conduct attracting correction. So they said reasonableness is a fine term to use. It's not vague, it's flexible, and with all of these common law limitations, it's not too vague. It's just fine. Now, our board dissented and said that, yes, that's fine, but these common law limitations have been applied inconsistently. And it's not the role of the court to read down the statutes. At some point, it just needs to be rewritten. So we do not need to restrict the application of this law, or it says our board does agree that the law needs to be restricted, but it needs to be restricted because it's I don't understand this. You need to restrict the application of the law, but not because it's what the code says. It's because it's what the Constitution requires. That seems to be the same thing. Our board also agrees that reasonable is a fine term to use. So basically saying that McLaughlin and the majority are reading down the bill or the act to such a degree that we might as well just rewrite the statute because it's obviously unconstitutional. Now, Binney takes it a step further and says that the physical assault against a child is allowed in this circumstance, so they're limiting the rule against assault. But if it were against an adult, it would, of course, be assault, and this offends the equality guaranteed under Section 15(1) of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And he says that, he or she, I'm not sure, says this is fine, but it needs to be argued under Section 1 of the Charter. And there's one more dissent that says, no, it's unconstitutional and it cannot be justified under Section 1 of the Charter. Let's just get rid of this. So basically, Section 43 was decided to be not too vague based on the common law limitations that have been put on it, and based on the decision that reasonableness is a fine term to use. It's flexible. You can bring in experts to decide what is reasonable as society changes. So criminal code interpretations. Why do we interpret the criminal code? Because there is ambiguity in it. The statutory language often supports 2 or more meanings. It also may be sometimes vague, and this may be the result of intention. The legislatures may be unable or unwilling to agree on a precise word. It may also be unintentionally vague in the sense that they did not anticipate alternative readings, perhaps because the act was passed 70 or 80 or 100 years ago. So criminal code interpretation,